morning, everyone. We would like to thank God for providing us with water. Nowadays, we have, I think, enough or sufficient provision of water, though there are still days na may mga oras na walang supply. But at least most of the days within the week, we have water. And we thank God for that. I have not seen comments about water any longer in Facebook. So that signifies that everybody gets water within the week on a regular basis already. And we are praising and honoring the Lord for that. I remember a story of a man who lived in a very isolated area. And in that village, they had a problem about water also. So the chieftain of the village decided to go to a journey, searching for an oasis, looking for a place where he can find water with enough provision or sufficient source of water. And so he journeyed. 1 week later, he was still traveling on a drought and dry land. 2 weeks later, 3 weeks, after a month of walking, he arrived in a place of civilization. He noticed that there are several rooms in one place that he went to. And so he entered. When he went inside it, he saw a person walking. And then he decided to follow the person. Lo and behold, this person that he followed went to a toilet or a CR. When he entered, he followed also the man. He saw different faucets, several faucets inside the toilet. And he was fascinated because in each of those faucets, water came out. Every time the man would twist the faucet switch, he saw that water came out. And so he asked the person, where can I get this kind of thing? And the guy said, there's a lot of it in hardwares all around. You can just buy. And so because he was bringing with him some goods from the mountains, he sold those goods because he found out that he needed money. He sold those goods just for him to buy some faucets. So he went there and bought. And he was very excited going back to the community that he left. He went there, and when he arrived after another month of walking, he shouted, "Hey everyone, I have now the solution to our problem." And so everybody came out and he was excited. He showed to them, "What shall we do with this? You just tie it on a stick and then just put it anywhere and then water will come out." And so they did that, after which they switched on. There was no water. And I think the mistake that that man committed was he failed to recognize the difference between a channel and a source. Because those faucets were just channels by which the water can come, and the source of those water that came through the faucets were actually not there with him. So the problem is that he failed to recognize between a source and a channel. And there was one person, or actually not one person, but one family in the Old Testament who experienced the same. And we would be looking at the experience of Elimelech and Naomi and their family as they journeyed from Bethlehem to Moab. So let's open our Bibles in the book of Ruth. We will be starting today a series in the book of Ruth, and so we will be dealing with the first chapter this morning. And I would read a portion of it, and then I will explain, and then read, and then explain as we go through the narrative here. So we will begin with verses 1 and 2. Verse 1. Now it came about that in those days, when the judges governed, that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephratites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. May the good Lord bless the reading of his word. There are some ironic situations that I have observed in this part of the narrative. And one of those are these words underlined on your screen. I want you to take note of the word famine in the land and Bethlehem. Now, this is ironic. Why did I say that? Because if you look at in this text and see the meaning of the word Bethlehem, every time you see a word Beth in the scriptures, it means house. It's a Hebrew translation for the word house, okay? Beth means house. Lehem is bread. Meaning to say, it's a place of abundance, supposedly. It's a place where food is there. It's a place of granary. It's a place where there is no lack of supply, supposedly. But what was happening here is that there was a famine in the land. And what caused this famine? If you go back to the previous book, you would notice that in the book of Judges, go to the third slide, please. You'll see that in the book of Judges, in the last chapter of it, in the last verse of the last chapter, chapter 21, verse 25, you would see that there is a statement that goes like this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Anyone did what was right in his own eyes. And if I'm going to look back at the background of this statement, go back to the second slide, please. You would see that the famine was actually caused by the situation or the cycle of the problem that was like a cycle in the book of Judges. Take note that Ruth happened either within the time of the book of Judges or right after it. But most likely it happened within the time period of the book of Judges. So if you study the book of Judges, there is a cycle happening there. The people disobeyed God, and then after which God sends judgment. And then after the judgment, the people will cry before God for help. And then after that, God would send someone to rescue them. And then they would commit mistake again. They would sin before God again. And then judgment would come again. And then they would cry out to the Lord. It's actually a cycle in the book of Judges. Different judges were their name in the scriptures. And in each one of them, before every person was sent by God, there was a cycle happening. And so the book of Ruth falls on the same situation. And what was happening was the people were doing what was right in their own eyes. This is actually an old version of what we call today a postmodernism, wherein every person has his own way of judgment. There is no meta-narrative. There is no basis for a moral standard. And this was happening already even in the Old Testament. Every person did what was right in his own eyes. And so, because of that, God sent judgment. And usually the judgment, either it was an oppression from a neighboring country or it was a famine. So this time, Ruth, Elimelech, the whole family left Bethlehem because there was a famine. And they left from that land, which is called the house of bread, a place of provision, a place where there was no supposedly lack of any food. They left that place, the place where God brought the Israelites, and they went to Moab. And I think it was a big mistake for them to leave that place. Why did I say that? Because in the very beginning, God said, I'm going to bring you to a land that flows with milk and honey. There was supposed enough provision, but because of the mistakes of the people, there was a problem. There came a famine. So leaving the place was actually not the solution. Are you following me? When a solution, sometimes when we face a problem, we come up with a solution, and sometimes there are solutions that we make that actually would just bring us to another problem. Have you experienced that? And this is what I realized out of that portion of the narrative. When a solution violates God's will, it will cause another problem. It's a reality that many of us would experience in our day-to-day existence. So this family decided to live. Elimelech led his family. Let's look at now verse 2. Let's zoom in verse 2. And this is what we see here. The man's name was Elimelech. When I was reading this, I said, why did the writer really say the man's name is Elimelech? Is there a significance in this name? And I realized that there is really a very big significance on his name. Why did I say that? Because if you break down that name and try to understand from the original context or the original language, actually Elimelech means God is king. El is God, Melech is king. So the meaning of his name actually is God is king or my God is king. And if you put that in contrast with what we read in the book of Judges on the last verse of the last chapter. It says, there was no king in Israel. Now, there is an irony again in this situation, because the text is saying that there was no king in Israel, and yet there is someone here whose name is actually Elimelech. God is king. So even if there were no leaders existing in Israel back then, people went to sin, people committed mistakes, and then they received judgment, and then they cry out to God. Those cycle was happening, and in the midst of that thing, actually, even if they thought that there was no king leading them, it was actually God leading them as king. And the Israelites were envious about this situation. That's why when you look at the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, you would see that, Lord, we want a king like the other nations surrounding us. We want somebody to lead us. But actually, seeing even in the name of Elimelech, it was God who's serving as a king before his people. And so this is a very ironic situation that this guy left that place. And in fact, his name bears the reality that God is king. And if God is king, God is in control. If God is king, God is the one who's going to provide. But they left the place. And we'll continue. When we look at those situations, sometimes we would be able to say, actually in the details of our lives, we miss the point. That even God is at work already, we don't actually see it. And the name of Elimelech would remind everyone, supposedly be reminding everyone of them that, hey, there is a king existing. You don't need anybody else to lead you, because if you just adhere to what he desires, if you just follow his will, then everything is going to be all right, supposedly. But you violated, you disobeyed, and that's what would happen. And what happened is this: they left from Bethlehem and they went to Moab. The scenario became even worse, because the text would tell us, let's go back to the passage, we'll start with verse 3. In verse 3, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. You seeing what I'm telling earlier here? You came up with a solution because you were facing a problem. You came up with a solution, and that solution just ended up with another problem. And then what happened next was this. They took for themselves, the children, the sons of Naomi and Elimelech, they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. And the name of the one of them is Orpah, and the name of the other is Ruth. This is another problem. Why? Because Moabites were not supposed to be intermarriage with the Israelites, or the Israelites were not supposedly be marrying the Moabites. Where did they come from? Going back to the earlier part of the history, you would find out that Moabites came from Lot. And Moabites were the result of the incestuous relationship of Lot with his daughter. So sabi ni God, huwag kayong makipag-relate sa mga Moabite. This is another violation. This is another problem. So a problem came up, and they came up with a solution, and then that solution actually led to another problem, which led to another problem, and there is another problem that existed here in verse 5. Then both Mahlon and Chilion, the children or the sons, also died. And the woman was bereft of her 2 children. The woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. So here comes Naomi, living in Bethlehem, a house of provision, a house of bread, a house of food. But there was a famine, so they left. They went to Moab, looking for a solution, trying to find a hope. And when they were there, her husband died. Her 2 sons married Moabite women. And later, those children also died. She was stripped off from everything, and she was left with her 2 daughters-in-law. 2 daughters-in-law na hindi niya dapat daughters-in-law, kasi sabi ni God, don't marry Moabite women. You see the situation now. This was really a difficult and tough moment for Naomi. And what happened next was this. When you look at verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. What was the reason for that? For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. What was the situation now? Why did she decide to go back to Bethlehem? Why did she decide to leave Moab and go back to that place where she came from? Because God already showed His favor. And during those days, when a famine comes, usually it's caused by lack of water. When there is no enough water, the land will become very dry, the livestock would die, the plants cannot grow, there will be no harvest, there will be no food. If there is no food, there is no water, there is no life. People will die. And we complained about lack of water in the previous months here in Zamboanga, right? But the situation here of Naomi and her family and Elimelech was even far worse than what we have here in Zamboanga. We can still see trees growing. We can still have water even if it's just once a week. We can still have something to drink. But in that area, when a famine comes, it lasts for years that there is no water, the land is so dry, the plants won't grow, there is no harvest, the animals would die, and even you would just see your neighbors dying one after another. So that was the situation, very tough condition. And so when she found out that the Lord already intervened into the situation, she decided to go back to Bethlehem. And then her daughters-in-law also decided to go with her, but sabi ni Naomi, no, not my daughters. Don't go with me anymore. You better go back to your own family and go back to worshiping your own gods. Because if you come with me, I don't have a husband and I don't have other children anymore. And you know, it's really a very difficult situation if you don't have a husband and you don't have sons back then. Because women in that culture could not own anything. It had to be owned by a male. So you need to be attached to a male for you to have something. And here comes Naomi. She lost everything. That's why she told Ruth and Orpah, you go back to your own family. Don't come with me. I don't have children anymore that you can marry. I don't have, even if I am going to marry with someone and I would have a baby this evening, I don't think so that you could wait for them. I remember somebody, a very pretty lady at maybe around 15 or 18 year old, saw my son and she said, you know, you're so handsome. Aantayin kita, sabi niya sa anak ko. My son is 3-year-old. Come on. And Naomi said, if I'm going to give birth to two sons tonight, I bet you could not wait for them. You'll just marry someone else. So you better go back to your own family. And I'm praying that the Lord would deal kindly with you, that you would have husbands also. But Ruth said, Lord, I insist. I want to go with you. And Orpah gave up after the second insistent with Naomi. And she gave up and she left. And we don't have any picture of Orpah anymore in the scriptures. But Ruth really insisted to go with Naomi. And so they left Moab and they went back to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the people there saw them. They didn't recognize Ruth because it was their first time to see Ruth. But they still recognized Naomi. But it was the statement that they said about Naomi was in a form of question. And this is what they said. Look at verse, I think it's verse 19, or let's look at the Bible. Verse 19. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred. Take note of that word. All the city was stirred. And everybody probably came out of their houses and looking at, whoa, come on. Somebody left many years ago and now she's back. And here's the question. Is this Naomi? Is that Naomi? Why did they ask that question? Why did they ask that question? The community was stirred. Probably, as I have mentioned, everybody came out of their houses, or some of them just peeped from their window and said, is that Naomi? Well, for quite some time she was gone, but usually you still recognize a person's face. I can still recognize some of my classmates in elementary. Whenever I see them this time, and I have not seen them for 20 years or even more, I look at them and I could still see resemblance, big resemblance of who they were before, how they look, how they appeared, with how they appear today. So you could still recognize someone, but these people in Bethlehem, they asked, is this Naomi? Hindi ba magbabago yung itsura mo? If you have gone through a famine, you lost your husband, your children married women that you don't like, supposedly, because they came from another tribe which God told you not to marry with, and then your children, your sons also died, and now you are left with your daughters-in-law who didn't also own anything just like you. And you left everything in Bethlehem already. Now you're going back there. Can you imagine the stress that she had gone through? Can you imagine the pain that she went through in life? Can you imagine the deep problem in her heart and mind that she dealt with? Don't you think that deep inner problem won't affect the physical appearance? Kaya tignan mo yung katabi mo, pag mukhang stress, may problema yan. What's happening inside you comes out or is reflected often in your physical appearance. And that's a reality. So when Naomi and Ruth came into Bethlehem, is that Naomi? Do you remember this? See these pictures. You remember this guy? Next slide, please. There you go. He's the guy from the Home Alone. Did you watch that movie? Have you watched that movie already? He was 9-year-old that time. And that on the other side is a picture of this guy when he was 31. He got into drug addiction, and that affected so much even his physical appearance. I'm just trying to show you what happens in the physical appearance of a person if there is something wrong within him. And Naomi has gone through such very difficult situations in life. And that's why when they arrived in Bethlehem, the ladies and the women said, is this Naomi? We barely recognize her. Yeah, probably she had gone through so much. And that's a reality. That's a reality. And that's why when the women said, is this Naomi? Listen to the response of Naomi in verse 20. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Do you know what's the meaning of Naomi? Naomi means pleasant. So probably, just as the name shows it, probably she looked so pleasant back then when she left Bethlehem. Because in those days, often your name speaks something about you, either in the physical aspect or your character, or there is something, a characteristic in your life that speaks about your name, or something that your parents wish when you were born. So probably Naomi was really beautiful. She looked pleasant back then when she left Bethlehem. And so when they came back, the people said, is this Naomi? Is this pleasant? And Naomi responded to that saying, don't call me Naomi, you call me Mara. And the meaning of Mara is bitter. You call me bitter because God has made my life bitter. And when she said bitter, she's thinking about the famine that she went through. She's thinking about the loss of her husband. She's thinking about her sons marrying Moabite women. She's thinking about the death of her children. Those were the tragic moments that she considered bitter in her life. That's why I no longer live that kind of life. I no longer profess that kind of name, the message of the name that my parents gave me. I am no longer pleasant. I am bitter. She was very attached to her husband, and I can understand that. She was very attached with her sons. Because again, as I have told you, she could never own anything unless the husband is there or the children, the sons, were there. So if she lost her husband, she lost her sons, that means to say she lost everything. Was it really everything? That she failed to recognize the presence of Ruth beside her. This is something lesson that I have learned out of this portion of the narrative also. Too much attachment with what was lost blinds us from appreciating with what is at hand. There are things that you have in life that you don't appreciate because you keep on thinking of those things that you lost already. She was thinking that nothing was left with her. She failed to recognize that there is somebody right on her side. And in verse 21, this is what she said also. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why did she say that? Again, it had something to do with her husband and her sons. Now that they are gone, she cannot own anything. She has nothing with her. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. And what was happening? Nothing. There's nothing I have this time. That's the point that actually Naomi is saying. My life is no longer pleasant. I have nothing. Yes, I have here with me Ruth, but still she has nothing. So nothing plus nothing, there is nothing still. We have nothing. And that is why we came back here. Why did they go back there? They went back to Bethlehem because they heard that God already showed His favor in the midst of His people. And this is a beautiful picture that we should know and recognize, that in the midst of a very tragic situation in the land of Israel, particularly in the land of Judah, it was seen by the neighboring countries that God is present, God is at work, and God showed Himself in the difficult moments that they have gone through. Naomi saw that also. And that's why she's back, because when she realized that God is at work in Bethlehem, she said, I don't like just to stand here and see what's happening there, but I want to go back there and experience it with myself. I saw God at work. I want to be there also because I want to experience the very presence and power and provision of God. Out of this very desperate condition, Naomi began to recognize that even if she lost her husband, even if she lost her sons, even if she considers herself bitter and no longer deserving with the name Naomi, pleasant, even if she had gone through those difficult times in life, she now realized that everything that were attached to her, that was attached with her, are actually just channels, and the main source of those blessings that she experienced is actually God Himself. When you recognize the source, who is God, you learn to move forward from the loss of channels. Sometimes we are so attached with people around us. Sometimes we don't like even to take one step forward because we lost them. Sometimes we are so attached with the job that we have, and we don't like to step one more forward because we lost it. Wake up, my brother. Wake up, my sister. Because even if you lost anything, everything that surrounds you, even if you lost everybody around you, as long as you have God right beside you, channels can come, blessings can still come. I don't know what your situation is this time. I don't know if you have a difficulty moving on. I don't have if you have a difficulty stepping forward. I don't know, if you have something that is really disturbing your heart today. But let me tell you this. God is at work. God is still moving. God is still molding you. God is not finished with you yet. And He wants you to step forward. Once you see His hand move, don't tell yourself, I will just stand here and see it. You tell yourself, I'm going to step forward and I want to be there where God is moving. Because God is still at work. And even if you lost anything and everything in your life, as long as you have Him right beside you, blessings can still come. I am praying that you would take this in your heart. I know some of you were bruised when you came here to church this morning. I know some of you are hurting. I know some of you are disappointed. I know some of you had gone through a quarrel or an argument. I know some of you are being disturbed by something in your mind. But I want you to leave this house of worship this morning with the assurance that your God is at work, even if you consider yourself in a famine this time. And in the midst of that situation, there can be a harvest. And we will see how God provided Ruth and Naomi, for Ruth and Naomi. So I would like to see you back here next Sunday. And we will continue with the second chapter of the book of Ruth. Because God would continue to display His power, His love, His grace, His kindness in the lives of these two individuals. And this same God that displayed His power, His kindness, and love to Naomi and Ruth is the same God that you worship today. So don't leave the house of worship of God this morning with an empty heart. Don't leave this house of worship without hope. Because that God is still at work until today. Cheer up, press on. God is at work. You have God, you have everything. God bless you and good morning.